Hello viewers, I'm Vikram Khanna, Associate Editor of the Straits Times, and it's my pleasure to moderate this roundtable on Budget 2022. We have with us for the discussion no other than the architect of the budget himself, Finance Minister Lawrence Wong.
Hello.
And together with, on his right, Chee Meng, Secretary General of the NTUC.
Hello.
On his right is Professor Sumit Agarwal, who is Professor of Real Estate and Economics, as well as a Professor of Finance at the National University of Singapore. And on my right, we have Suan Teck, who is Head of Research at UOB.
Hi, Vikram.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Okay, let's start at the beginning,
Sure.
which is the title of the budget, which is charting our new way forward. The question is, what is new about this way forward? And to what extent is this budget a departure from the past?
Sure. Well, thanks,
Finance
Vikram,
Minister.
for this question to start off. Every budget builds on the ones that came before it. But there is a sense, indeed, that this year is different. Why? Because we have been fighting a generational crisis for the past 2 years. And we are still fighting the pandemic, but there is now a clearer sense of the post-pandemic future that we are confronting. And I think all of us are aware that it will be a future that's quite different from the past. It cannot just be a business as usual approach in confronting this new future. How will the next few years be different? Number one, our population is aging rapidly, and we'll have to deal with that challenge. Number two, we'll have to make decisive moves to decarbonize and tackle climate change as part of a global movement. One may say it's still very far away, mid-century, 2050, 30 years from now, but in fact, we don't have a lot of time left. We have to start taking steps over the coming decade in order to get to net zero by mid-century. And then thirdly, the fact that we are increasingly seeing an unpredictable, volatile, and dangerous world. We anticipated this, and we mentioned this even before the Ukraine incident, before Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think since then, it's even clearer to everyone that we are in a different world order. So with all of these changes, it's quite clear that the government will have to do more to support Singaporeans, to take better care of our seniors, to help everyone through the green transition, and to provide people with more assurances through life's uncertainties and reduce inequalities in our society. And if government has to do more, then we have to find ways to raise more revenues and meet that funding gap. How we do so is important too. And we've highlighted our basic philosophy on this, which is that everyone should contribute something to taxes and get something back in return, but to different degrees. Basically, those with greater means should contribute more and get less benefits, and those with fewer means will contribute less but get much more benefits. And that's, we believe, a fair and progressive system of taxes and transfers that will also ensure sound and sustainable fiscal finances for our future. So to sum it all, it is, when we say charting our new way forward, there are very significant steps we are taking that will be different. And this budget is really the first in a series of moves that we would like to make to strengthen our social compact and build a fairer, greener, and more inclusive Singapore.
Thank you for that. We'll get into some of these issues, including what you plan to do in the future.
Sure.
So, but meanwhile, would other panelists like to weigh in on what they think is new about this budget?
I would just reiterate, I think what the minister pointed out, all these things, all four topics, inequality and using taxation to tackle inequality is very important. Aging society and thinking about the healthcare needs of the aging society is another very important issue. Sustainability and thinking about how to tackle sustainability and also labor market conditions, bringing in technology and education, both at the same time to tackle the problems that we face in labor markets is important. And I think the budget is ambitious in all four fronts.
Secretary General, any thoughts?
The macro conditions, Minister and our esteemed professor have painted those conditions that would build for the future. And I think the budget is a progressive one, laying the foundational parts of it so that we can move forward. But what I found to be refreshing in the budget, it has the small men in the center as well. Building all this for what? Why are we doing this? It is for the Singaporeans. Not just this generation, but the future generation. So I think it's a progressive budget with an element of $100 million to actually enable workers to move together with the times. And in many parts of the components of the budget, building a new compact, if you would, a social compact that has the Singaporean at the center. Amidst all the complexities of the world, all the intricacies of policies, well, if we distill it all out, laying a strong foundation for Singapore ahead to be a successful country, having the raison d'etre of building it for Singaporeans, inclusive, fairer, and hopefully greener and more sustainable, meeting the different challenges. So I supported the budget very much from the NTUC standpoint.
Okay, we'll get more into the NTUC issues in a minute. But meanwhile, Teck-in, would you like to add to that?
Sure, Vikram, thank you. I think for the budget, I also agree in terms of the progressivity and also the strengthening of the social compact. This is very important because of these past 2 years. I think because of the pandemic, I think certain segments of the society really, I think, fallen behind. Right? Some parts of the society able to do well. If you can look around who are the ones doing well, but some parts have fallen behind. And this is not just a Singapore problem. I think it's a worldwide issue. And then we are able to tackle this sort of strengthening of social compact is very important because that will ensure, I think, social stability and also in terms of progressivity. And it's all shown up in the budget measures as well, your income tax and even the GST as well. All these, I think it's important to have that progressivity, the strengthening of the social compact in terms of the fairness and inclusivity, and of course the carbon tax. That's where the greener and the greener future for Singapore. And all these are important elements, and I'm glad to see all these elements in that this year's budget.
Thanks. Very good. Now, before we get into the details of the budget, there's one issue I'd like to raise, which is all over the news, and that is the Russia's war on Ukraine and its impact. We're already seeing this in the form of the rise of the three Fs, the prices of 3 Fs, that is food, fuel, and freight. It's already going up. We've been running stories on this, including one today in the Straits Times. It's rippling through the economy. It's affecting the food sector. It's affecting industry. It's affecting consumers, people who drive, people who hail rides, and so on. So the question is, Mr. Minister, what is your assessment of the likely impact of the war on Ukraine, as well as the sanctions on the Singapore economy?
It's something that's still highly uncertain because these are still early days, in fact. I don't think anyone can predict with any certainty the trajectory of how the conflict will evolve in the coming weeks or even months. Best case scenario, there is a path towards de-escalation on both sides. We hope for that, but you cannot rule out the fact that this can go the other way either. So we'll have to monitor this very closely. In fact, we already anticipated the impact when we were working on the budget. At that time, there was not yet an invasion, but tensions were already rising, and one could already tell potentially that there would be some impact. And that's why in developing the packages in the budget, we had put in a lot more resources and funding to help households cope with the possibility of rising prices. And that means this year, because of what we are putting into the budget this year and next year, and in fact, even in the coming years, households will receive significant help already in terms of cash, utilities, rebates, CDC vouchers to help with food costs, SNCC rebates even, right? So a whole range of different help are already provided for in the budget. We will continue to monitor the situation, and as we have said just now, we have said before, if the situation were to worsen, we will be prepared to do more. Our direct links with Russia and Ukraine are very limited. It's really the broader impact that can happen because of the impact on the global economy, impact on global energy markets. That's a very worrying sort of concern. And maybe to some extent the impact on global food supply, because Russia and Ukraine, the major exporter of wheat, and maybe to some extent supply chains, because they also supply, they are major exporter of some precious metals as well. So we are monitoring each of these very carefully. The impact in which the conflict will sort of have on global markets, global supply chains, and then in turn, how that might impact the Singapore economy as well as inflation. And if things were to worsen, we will not hesitate to put out additional measures, and we have the means to do so.
Right, thanks. Teck, you're monitoring this all very closely, right, in your capacity as research head. What do you think? Do you think it's possible, as some economists are suggesting, that there could even be another recession globally?
Okay, Vikram, thanks for the question. I think I agree with Minister, what Minister said just now about this uncertainty. Is really uncertainty. It's really uncertain at this point. It's still early days to assess whether it will be a recession down the road and when would that happen. So there's really uncertain at this point, and the range is very wide. But what is certain right now is the impact on inflation. Right, you mentioned about the food and the fuel, and all these costs are really going up because of the impact on energy markets, the supply chain, and also some of these agricultural exports and industrial metals as well from these two countries. So now there's all this upheaval that's going on prices. So how high this inflation is going to go, and at what point is going to eat into consumer budget, at what point is going to eat into companies' budget, and that's where the uncertainty is. We know that prices are going up, right? At what point it's going to hit us on reducing economic activities. That's the part that we have to really, like what the minister said just now, we have to really monitor closely.
Right. Thank you. Professor Agarwal, have you been monitoring the situation as well?
Well, let me take a different view and say that I think we are trying to associate causation from the conflict to inflation in Singapore. I am less convinced there is causation of that. There may be correlation that, look, the two things are happening. I think inflation in Singapore is there because of many other factors, supply chain issues, labor issues, the pandemic, and now they may have gone up because of the war, or it's also possible that merchants are now taking advantage of this, who are exporting goods to Singapore, saying like, oh, this is because of the war. So there could be price gouging as a result that could be happening, which happens quite a lot in America, other countries. When there's a disaster, merchants take advantage of that fact. So I would say to the government that, yes, this is important to monitor, but it's also important to monitor if there are nefarious activities by individuals.
Sure. I think that's a fair comment, that we need to watch against price gouging, but the direct impact on many businesses, I think, will come through energy prices. There is no doubt about that, because oil prices are the way they are today and may potentially go further and longer depending on how the conflict pans out. So that will clearly have a direct impact on businesses as well as consumers.
Let me give a bottom-up view.
Sure.
Whatever the causation correlation, the fact of the matter is that the common man is bearing the brunt of cost of living pressures, in whether it's fuel, our taxi drivers, bus operators running SMEs, freight charges have gone multiple fold times. So our logistics suppliers to our different social enterprises are giving us very, very clear feedback. Trajectory is clear, whether it's caused by the war or the pandemic or our own internal supply issues. Well, the pressures on the ground are very real. So I do appreciate different elements of the budget that are preparing some money to put aside to assist our transport operators. So the taxi drivers, the private hire drivers, the bus operators are all suffering because of the fuel increases. Our citizens, our workers are also telling me very clearly that chicken prices have gone up, eggs have gone up. And over the weekend, I did my own survey of the supermarket. Indeed, has gone up quite a lot. So I welcome the government's proactive stance in preparing. If we need to step in, I'm glad we are ready. On NTUC side, well, we do our little bit to help. Our supermarkets are putting in discounts to help our pioneer generation, our elderly, and a new program really to put in 5% discounts on Fridays. Over 100 essential items in our supermarket, ranging from milk powder to adult diapers. All of us chipping in to build an inclusive society is equally as important and as important as having an inclusive society. We just cannot have it without all of us participating in it. So I do ask employment partners, government to work with us to upgrade our workers as well. Because ultimately, whatever assistance we can provide would be a stopgap measure, 6 months, 1 year, whatever it may be. But the sustainable way really is to keep our workers, our citizens in tandem with the changing world, with the progress of our Industry 4.0 possibilities. How can we actually partner government employers with the workers in a fundamental way forward to review what you asked about what is new in the budget? Well, it's same, but different. Operating in a completely different world with the same fundamental values that we hold dear as a country, as a people, as a labour movement.
What SecGen said is also sort of the flip side of what Prof. Sumit said. There will be irresponsible companies doing price gouging, but I'm glad that in fact there are the majority of companies that are very highly responsible and in fact going out of their way to offer good value for money products and services, like the NTUC Enterprises, Fair Price, and many others who will offer more house brands, help consumers stretch their dollar. And I think that's a good thing. It's not all the ugly side of businesses, but there are many responsible partners as well, which we will continue to work with. And again, I go back to the point I made earlier that we already have significant help coming through this year and in subsequent years as well, but especially this year when you pull together all the different things we are doing for small businesses as well as for consumers. It's hard to hoist all of this in sometimes because we put it out as the household package, the GST assurance package, GST vouchers. What does that all mean, right? But actually, when you pull it together for the individual in terms of cash, in terms of utilities rebates, in terms of CDC vouchers, in terms of SNCC rebates, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of help, and we will do more to help people understand that this package of measures is going to come their way very soon.
Right. Well, I hope NTUC is able to sustain its discounts.
We'll do our very best.
Very good. Very
But
good.
I must say that NTUC has done a great job because in some of these items, I was very surprised that I think the government has put in a lot of efforts as well to diversify our food supply.
Yes.
So as a result, our food costs actually are not as scary as some other places. Over the weekend, I was just talking to my uncle who is in Canada. I told him, wow, in Singapore, a tray of eggs of 30 pieces, a few years ago, it was 350, 360. I thought it was expensive already. You only buy it about 320 maybe. But now it's already 650. Then my uncle told me in Canada, the same tray is $15. So because of this, I think the diversified supplies we get, for example, just eggs, we get from Poland, of places in Thailand, and from so many places in Singapore as well, our own local producer. Right. So we get a wide diversified sources of product, and that help to contain our costs as well. So that is something to take comfort.
Yep.
You know, just like our comparing GST, is it high? But if you compare to other countries, Singapore actually is not that bad.
The pressures on the lower income are really quite high.
Yes.
So on Thursdays we have another discount program for the blue CHAS holders, the CHAS card holders, so that we try our very best to help people stretch the dollar if they shop at NTUC. If they don't, if they find better prices elsewhere, I'm actually quite happy as well. So long as we are able to hold a certain benchmark across all the goods. Right. We can't be the cheapest in a competitive market. People will undercut each other, right? So we can't be the cheapest, but we hope to at least set the benchmark. And to the folks that need it most, well, we try to be targeted to lend some assistance that NTUC can hopefully sustain. Yeah.
So, good. So since we're talking about prices, let's move on to one of the hottest topics in the budget, which is the GST. Now, I think the question here, which a lot of people ask, is what alternatives were considered before you decided to raise the GST? Yeah. I mean, perhaps higher corporate taxes, higher income taxes, or a broader tax base. Did you consider these alternatives, and why did you reject them? And what other alternatives might you have considered?
Sure. It's certainly a question I've had to deal with a lot after the budget. And I've consistently told everyone, we've considered all of these alternatives. But let's take a step back and look at the broader perspective. We said that our spending needs will go up and our funding gap will increase. By how much? Well, our overall revenues will keep pace with GDP in the coming decade. That's our expectation. On the spending side, we are currently spending about 18% of GDP, and we expect that this will increase to 20% of GDP or more by 2030. In fact, if we can keep it to 20% or 2% of GDP increase, that would already be very good. That would already mean a slowing in the expenditure increase compared to the decade ago. Now, somebody, we say 2% of GDP sounds like a very small figure. 2% of GDP is $10 billion a year in today's GDP, 10 billion. The GST increase only yields us $3.5 billion a year. So to put things in perspective, I think this whole debate about maybe there are alternatives to GST misses the point, because it's not GST or something else. It's GST and other tax changes, because the gap is that large, right? So if you think about it, then you say, well, how about no GST, but put the load, replace it with something else. If you were to put it all on income tax, be it personal or corporate income tax, I think it will be unbearable. I mean, first of all, there will be a huge impact on our overall competitiveness. And if you say personal income tax, it's very unlikely that you can have a small group of people just bearing the entire load. It will, in the end, mean that the middle or upper middle income groups will have to pay more too. So it's probably not such a wise thing to do. Economists would all tell you that a better way of taxing is in fact through the value-added tax or the GST, because it imposes least distortions on the economy, and it has the least impact on our overall competitiveness, rather than to load it all on income taxes, be it personal or corporate, which will impact our competitiveness, work incentives, and will have more distortions on the economy. Now, the traditional objection to the GST, or the one thing that keeps coming up, is, yes, I understand all that from an economic point of view, but the GST still hurts the poor. But that objection is not valid in Singapore, because we implement GST with a permanent GST voucher, which we have significantly enhanced. which means that the GST increase will not hurt the low-income groups in Singapore. We are able to effectively neutralize the impact of the GST increase for the low-income groups. So there should not be any basis for that objection, right? And so when you pull it all together, we have in fact worked out a package of revenue measures in this budget, which we believe are fair, they are inclusive, and they are effective. And it's a balanced package that we think will be necessary in order for us to close the funding gap.
Very good. But I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
On the threshold at which the GST can be charged by companies.
Yes.
Our threshold is a turnover of $1 million
That's
per year.
Yes.
Other countries' thresholds are way lower.
Yes.
I mean, it's probably below the equivalent of $200,000,
Yes.
almost everywhere.
Yeah.
Even in Malaysia, when they had GST, the threshold was 500,000 ringgit, which works out to about $170,000. So we're like 5 times, our threshold is 5 times above other countries. Now, could we not lower the threshold to broaden the tax base? Why can't we do this?
Sure. Well, it's always a judgment call. I mean, balancing between revenue needs as well as compliance, especially for the smaller businesses. And with all the changes that are happening already, the cost increases, the impacts of supply chains, cost of raw materials, the smaller businesses are the ones that are hurting the most. So if we were to impose this on them, they are the ones who will suffer too. So again, it's a judgment call. We review the thresholds all the time, and we will continue to do so, as we do with all other revenue options. We will have to keep on thinking through what are additional ways in which we can raise revenues in order to ensure sound and sustainable finances. But the assurance we want to give to every Singaporean is this: even as we think about raising revenues, we will do it in a way that's fair, that's progressive, that's inclusive. And that's our assurance to everyone.
Right.
And Vikram, if I may chime in.
Sure.
This is only the collection part of taxes. But actually, sometimes we should talk about the distribution part of what the government has collected. I was in government before. So for every tax dollar, if I recall my numbers correctly, that is collected in taxes, $4 goes down to the lowest income in Singapore in the form of education that is free. Each child, if they progress to different parts of our education, 250,000 to 300 plus thousands a year in their education career, into the healthcare needs of the elderly. So if you just look at the collection part of it, we have one view. But if you look at the distribution part where Minister was actually alluding to, right, $4 go to the lowest income. To the middle class, $2. To the upper class, some. Most of it actually goes into some. Most of it goes actually back into having succeeded in society. What are you willing to do to build an inclusive society that we desire? So actually, if we were to have two parts of the story of the overall taxation and distribution of wealth to equate to a more socially just society, I think having these two views in conversation, in tandem, together, actually would complete the story. Otherwise, we tend to be focusing on why collect taxes. Well, we do want to take care of the elderly. I do want to take care of the seniors. I also want a future Singapore that is dynamic, with young children amongst us that are the best educated, that can hopefully one day lead us forward. All this requires some form of funding. And if I may say so, because I was in government before, well, we want the fairest way to do the collection and the best way to distribute to build the country that we want.
I think that's such an important point. What matters is how you spend the money.
Yes.
Also, I mean, you can spend it in a way that is inclusive and so on, which makes it not regressive at all, or much less regressive.
Yes, absolutely.
Or you can spend it on something else, which is regressive.
And on
so
both
we have
fronts,
chosen.
On both fronts, we pay attention on both fronts.
Right.
On the taxation front, to make sure that however we collect revenues, we do so in a way that's fair and effective. On the spending side, However, we spend the money to make sure we achieve good value for money outcomes and that those with greater needs gets more. So when you add the two together, we in fact have a highly progressive system of taxes and transfers compared to most other countries.
Right. Yeah. Very good.
Yes, a few words
please.
On Minister's comments and Sec Gen's comments as well. I just maybe make an advertisement for the Ministry of Finance.
Oh,
just now when you asked,
you think they need one?
Unsolicited. Unsolicited.
Because just now, Vikram, you asked the question, what are the alternatives, right? What else can we do beside this? Actually, Ministry of Finance has a budget explainer webpage just came out recently.
Yes.
Yeah, just very recent because it was in yesterday's Finance Minister's Facebook page. There was a link down there. Then I click on the link. Wow, it's really a good explanation of what are the alternatives beside GST. And if I may just cite one of the figures in there, okay, if you don't do GST, how about personal income tax? Finance Minister just now mentioned that, a lot more people will pay tax because you need to replace, right, whatever the gap that we need to fund. And the top tax rate would have gone up, if I am not mistaken, to 44%.
That's right.
44%. I mean, can you imagine the kind of we're talking about competitiveness that Singapore, having competing with the rest of the, of the regional countries, that would be a big impact on our competitiveness. So I think GST, in this case, I'm in agreement actually to in terms of the using GST as a funding source, because if you look at other alternatives, asset taxes, the scale is so much smaller. The scale is so much smaller compared to income taxes and also consumption tax. And then the other way, of course, is that it won't disincentivize work because you have the GST, right? It will just it's based on consumption, not based on work or accumulation of wealth. So not so much of a problem there. And another good thing is that once we open up our borders, more tourists come in, they will contribute to a GST as well, because of their spending will be taxed, right? The GST, and they cannot claim back some of them. So I'm really hoping for the borders will reopen quickly, and then when GST rates,
that's a good reason to open up faster.
Yes, that's right. So come in and contribute and pay some of the taxes for us as well, right? So
I just want to mention though that in the 80s the top tax rate was about 50%.
Yes.
But of course you can't do this today. But we have lived with 50%.
So we have already progressively moved it down to make sure that we are competitive.
In the UK, it's 50% personal income tax and 25% GST.
In most OECD countries, the VAT rates are double digit.
Double digit. Japan is 10%.
So we really should be asking ourselves, why would Singapore be so special? I mean, and these countries also have very high income tax rates, easily way above 30% for the middle income. We're not talking about for the top tier. So, it's not, why would we somehow think that Singapore would be so different?
Maybe Straits Times can put all this information in 30 seconds, put it out there.
Okay, let's talk about another way in which Singapore is different on on land sales. Other countries include land sales in their budgets, revenue. The IMF approves of this. We don't do it. Why don't we do it?
We do, but we do it in an indirect way, right? Because we asked just now, why would Singapore be so different from the other countries where it comes to spending and revenues? Well, in some of these instances, we are not that different. We need more. We are going to spend more. We're going to need to collect more, and hence the need to raise taxes. But there is one thing that we are different. We have the reserves. And it's the key reason why we have such fiscal strength in Singapore, which contributes to our economic success. It's so vital to our economic success. So as part of our reserves framework, we've decided that land sales proceeds will go into the reserves, they will be invested, and then when the returns are generated from these investments, we'll get half of it through the net investment return contribution or the NIRC. So we are already using land sales proceeds, but in that indirect way, which we believe is also better and more sustainable. Because if we were to rely directly on land sales proceeds coming into our revenue line, our top line, I think there are two downsides. One is, number one, it's highly volatile. From year to year, it will make finances quite unpredictable. But secondly, and the bigger challenge we think is that there will be every incentive to keep land prices high, because you need it so much for revenue, which we have seen. This is not just theoretical. You've seen this happen elsewhere too. And I don't think that will be in the interest of Singaporeans or the economy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because Hong Kong is a case in point, I suppose, where the land sales are a major part of revenue and
The minister cannot
property
say that.
prices are. So I'm going to say, so property prices
Not
are the
just
highest
Hong
in the
Kong.
world.
And it hurts
not
the
just Hong
workers
It's not just
buying
Hong
the
Kong.
flats.
Yeah, that's the word.
It's not just Hong Kong. Sorry.
It's not just
Okay, no worries.
Okay, it's not just Hong Kong, but other Chinese cities. I'm sure Prof is more familiar, right? The other Chinese cities also rely on land sales to support their spending, and that causes a lot of problems for them. The local government debt, things like
It
that.
can also create perverse incentives. We see this around the world, because then the politicians can say, let me sell land because we need revenue.
Yeah.
So I think Singapore is doing it right on this front. In fact, I would suggest other countries to follow this model, because this way the hands are tied in how you can sell land, because it will come indirectly after many years. And that is, I think, in many ways, you see how Singapore is run, it can be exporting policy making.
Yes.
Well,
Very well.
we don't claim to export what works for us. It's something we have evolved over the years. It's suited to our circumstance.
But it's a policy that should be adopted, because tying your hands is very important. Otherwise, you get perverse incentives.
I fully agree.
So that's the thing. Every time I go to visit clients in overseas, example in China, and I always use Singapore budget as an example of what should be done. Right, our prudence and also discipline in terms of the land revenue, especially the land revenue, the land sale revenue, which is, I think, the right way to do. Like the Prof said, is the right way to do, because once we sold the land, you won't get to see it until 99 years later. Then it will come back to us. But when we spend, we'll spend this year. The money is gone. Right, so it's the right thing to do, to keep it in reserve so that can generate returns, and that's the right thing, really the right thing to do.
So while on the subject of land and property, another highlight of the budget was property taxes. Higher property taxes on expensive properties. Now, this, as you mentioned in the budget debate, this will bring in significant revenue when fully implemented. But one thing it may not do is to tame the property market, because the super rich who buy these expensive homes can afford these taxes, and it's not going to deter them from making purchases. So property prices may continue to rise. And if that happens, the wealth inequalities will continue to widen. So what can we do? So in short, this brings in revenue, but it will not tame wealth inequalities. So what can we do to reduce wealth inequalities further?
There are several things. The first and foremost, the property tax regime that we have today, it's not intended to cool the property market.
Okay.
Right? I mean, yes, it generates revenue. It's a principal means in which we tax wealth in Singapore, which is important, and we have continually adjusted it to make it more progressive, including the latest moves in this budget. But they are not intended principally to tame the property market, like you say. Because we have other tools for that.
Okay.
We have a whole suite of measures.
Off-budget, you mean? The off-budget measures?
The property cooling measures, which we just announced in December too. Right? And from time to time, in fact, we continue to review and monitor the market very closely. We are not against price increases, but we have always said that prices in the property market should rise in line with economic fundamentals. And if we see that sort of divergence, then we will look at updating and adjusting measures, whether it's through loans, whether it's through ABSD, or a whole different suite of measures which we have as part of our property cooling toolkit. So we will continue to do that. As for dealing with other forms of, or dealing with wealth inequalities, other forms of wealth and the issue of wealth inequality, that's something we will also continue to study. Ideally, we would like to tax wealth directly in the form of a net wealth tax. But that is, in practice, very hard to implement, which is why many OECD countries have also dropped the idea of a net wealth tax. Only 3 OECD jurisdictions retain a net wealth tax today. And the point is, wealth is mobile, and if there are differences across jurisdictions, wealth can and will move. So we have not ruled out net wealth taxes, but the challenge is how to go about implementing it, recognizing that this is intrinsically a very difficult thing to do, especially when many jurisdictions do not have one at present. So we will continue to review and study this.
Right. Okay. On estate duties, I think in the budget, in your budget, post-budget discussions, you mentioned that it's impractical because the rich are able to avoid it through creating trusts, tax planning, giving gifts, etc., etc. So would it be possible to redesign the estate duties to close these loopholes, number one? And or is it that, you know, it's a lost cause, the estate duties? And if so, what do we do about intergenerational inequalities, that is the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next?
Well, I will never say that things are a lost cause.
Okay.
We never give up hope. We should always look at ways in which we can improve our policies. But the same challenge applies. The same challenge which I talked about, net wealth taxes, applies to estate duties. Our experience with estate duties was, at the end, the people who had to pay, the disproportionate part of the burden was borne by the middle and upper middle income groups, whereas the very top end could tax plan estate duties away. It's actually a similar challenge with a net wealth tax. When we looked at other places with a net wealth tax, ideally the top end pays the net wealth tax, but in fact, the burden falls also on the middle income because they don't have the ability to move their monies around, whereas the top end do. So these challenges apply whether it's a net wealth tax or an estate duty. And we don't have a solution in sight yet, but like I said, we continue to study, we continue to review, look at the experiences of other jurisdictions, and also do not rule out the fact that perhaps international rules may evolve around this, just as they have on corporate taxes.
Okay,
And
very
also,
good.
And also to add that, I think the estate duty at the time, the tax was quite small. In terms of revenue.
The
The
collection
collection-wise, it's not going to move the needle in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
partly because they all tax plan.
Yeah, exactly. The top ones you can collect, but you're only left with the middle ones, which suffer in a way because of this.
Right. Sorry, I've just been told that we have 15 minutes, but I want to take a little longer. But I'd like to move on to the labor market, if I may. Secretary General, the unemployment figures have gone down, 3.2%, and I think the retrenchments have gone down.
Yes.
But the ratio of job vacancies to the unemployed has risen.
Yeah.
It's more than double what it was pre-pandemic. What does this reflect?
Well, it's a good news and bad news part to our story.
Okay.
If you just recall 12, 18 months ago, we were at maybe the edge of the waterfall in terms of employment.
Okay.
And I give a lot of credit to the government with the National Jobs Council, something that NTUC participated in. We created different levels of job switching, job upskilling, and government funding for people in transition to avoid unemployment situation that can shoot through the roof. So if you ask me now about whether this is a problem, well, yes, it's a problem, but to me, it's a pretty happy problem compared to 18 months ago.
Yeah.
Well, so there is now increased numbers of job vacancies compared to people looking for jobs. Well, one good thing out of this is that Singaporeans are getting back into the market with the first call. And I'm glad to see wages increasing, even as the cost of living goes up. So that's a good part of the story. But what we must do entailing is to ensure, or maybe seek government support in tandem, to actually help companies start moving to a post-COVID restructuring, looking at technology capitalization so that we can redesign jobs. Where there's shortage of labor, right? Up our productivity through automation and all the technologies possible. In the process, upskill workers in tandem with the grants that government has given NTUC. We will do our very best with the company training committees. Partner SMEs where they need help with our company training committees. Help them with some levels of technology road mapping. Put in the worker training program so that in tandem we create a win-win situation. Right. And very importantly, I am fully aware that our Singapore economy is outsized versus our population. Where these conditions are satisfied, where Singaporeans are fully employed, and we want to have an even better living, we know we need foreign complementary labor. And with these conditions, then we can bring in labor to augment our economy in a way that Singaporeans will accept that they have a level playing field, they have fair employment, and when Singapore succeeds, well, Singaporeans share in the success. And that ecosystem hopefully can lead into a virtuous cycle of reinforcing, where companies, banks need technologies. We can welcome some of those talents in, where manufacturers need top talents to come in to help them with advanced manufacturing. The Singapore economy, the Singapore citizenry can absorb that as well. So it is good news on the large. Some challenges the data presents me, but I hope we will look at these challenges with a view towards post-COVID and restructuring towards not just the economy, but the new workers' compact that we can succeed together with Singapore.
Right. Okay, since you mentioned foreign workers as well, complementing the local workforce, I think one of the issues in the budget was the increase in the minimum qualifying salaries for employment pass holders and S-pass holders. I think a lot of people feel that this will indeed lead to more Singaporean PMETs over the long term. But in the short term, it might push up wages. I think we have a lot of companies saying that I just have to hire foreign workers. There's no alternative because I can't find Singaporeans to do the job that needs to be done. So I just have to pay whatever the government asks. And if I do that, then I have to also pay my Singaporean workers more. And so this kind of leads to a sort of wage inflation in the short term. So is that a concern? And how do we deal with that?
Well, that's one of the reasons why when we implement this increase in the minimum qualifying salaries, we are doing it in stages. And this first stage only applies from next year onwards and for renewals from next year onwards, which means that because it depends on when your work pass is going to be renewed, it may not even happen next year. It may be 2024, 25, even 26, depending on when the work passes are renewed. So I think the short-term impact on pushing up wages can be mitigated with the phased implementation and the way we have done it. What's more important in ensuring that we have these clearly articulated minimum qualifying salaries is that, be it for S-Pass or E-Employment Pass, we are able to bring in people with the right caliber. And we have benchmarked it so that these are the ones who will come in at the top 1/3 of the Associate Professional Technicians. That's the S-Pass, APTs, and for the Employment Pass will be for the top 1/3 of professionals, managers, and executives, or PMEs. And that's the right level, we think, to ensure that these foreign workers and professionals come in at the right level, the right skill sets, and can complement our local workforce. The challenge that employers face about not being able to find enough manpower, I think is a real one. We fully understand those concerns. Part of it could also be the fact that our borders have not fully opened up. While the economy has bounced back very sharply last year and is continuing to grow. And I think there is a little bit of that, or more than a bit of that, but that's temporary. We are, as we see passing the peak of the Omicron wave, if the situation continues to improve in our healthcare system, we will be able to open up our borders, allow for freer international travel, so that pressure will come down. But the second part of it, exactly as SecGen said, is that constant process of investing in skills upgrading and skills matching. And that's absolutely important. You not only want to make sure that workers get the right, get their skill sets upgraded, we need to have a better matching between the demand and supply of skills. So we are sparing no effort there. In fact, we have been spending about $1.2 billion in skills upgrading in 2021, and we are continuing with that momentum. It's a huge increase from previous years. And we are working not just with training providers, but increasingly with companies themselves and with the unions. So the NTUC has a wonderful initiative called the Company Training Committees, where they work in a tripartite manner, coming together, sit down with the company management teams, understand what the company needs to do to restructure, to take on board new technologies, and then work through the skills that are necessary for their workers. And then with the programs that the government has, we can provide full support to ensure that the workers get the training that they need. It's a continuing effort, but we are redoubling our efforts on this front.
So, Vikram, if I just chime in with one point, I know you presented it that costs will go up. But on the flip side, if we do not have a reasonable minimal qualifying salary, it can lead to the reverse issues of what is happening at the lowest wages rungs of Singapore. Yeah. And that's why we have to step in with a progressive wage model as well. Because if it's set very low, it means that the Singaporeans that actually with the skill sets may not be employed and have to go to the lowest bidder. So actually the key principle in this is have a fair system where Singaporeans can see that it's a level playing field for them. I think that principle is very important either at the top end EP or at the special pass, work pass level. How do we actually look at the budget and the policies from MOM to create a level playing field? NTUC together with the employers actually came up with some of these recommendations to government to relook into this system, and I'm glad MOM proposed a compass system to have a more transparent way of leveling the playing field.
Yeah. This is the points-based
fair to the employer, helping the employer see beyond the short term into a sustainable system, and also fair to Singaporean PMEs that have the skill sets willing to upgrade, that they be given a fair chance. So I think that if you look at it in two-sided, two sides of the barrel, is a fairer picture.
Okay.
Yeah.
One is the point you mentioned before, Finance Minister, on reserves and NIRC. Okay, building up reserves has an opportunity cost in that it reduces present consumption in favor of future consumption. I think people accept that, yes, we must not only cater for the present, we must also provide for future generations, which is a fair point. But how do we decide on the appropriate balance between spending today and saving for tomorrow? I mean, for example, in the NIRC, we allocate 50% of expected real returns long term to the budget, and 50% goes for the future. Now, could we have more flexibility in this, in the sense that in a bad year, for example, during 2020, we could allocate more for the present, 60%, say, and in a good year, if we grow at 6, 7%, we could allocate less, maybe 40%. You can average it out to 50%. So why is it a 50% flat? Is that cast in stone? Why is it that way?
The idea that there is an opportunity cost in building up the reserves, I think it's something we need to ask ourselves, certainly. But if you think about this, are we unnecessarily holding back the economy today because we are putting more monies into the reserves? The answer is no. I mean, we are not growing below potential.
But couldn't
Are
we have bigger safety nets, social safety nets, for example?
Well, so from a macroeconomic point of view, are we growing below potential? No. Where is our output gap today? No, we are at full potential, right? So from that macroeconomic point of view, no, we are not, denying us opportunities today. Second point then is, are we accumulating reserves at a rate that is more than necessary? I would say the answer to that is no too. Why? Because yes, the reserves may be growing, but the size of our economy, the complexity of our needs and the challenges we face in the future are growing faster, much faster. Our children will face a more uncertain world, and the next generation will face much more challenges. And if you come back to how much we get in terms of our NIRC, we have already said that we're projecting the NIRC forward. We think it will keep pace with the economy. And even to do that would be a significant achievement given the headwinds that we see in the global investment environment. So from that point of view, we do not see our reserves as growing faster than necessary. On the other hand, I think a lot of the temptation will be the other way, that everyone thinks there is this big pot of money lying around somewhere. What's the harm? Let's just use a little bit. Let's just tweak some of the parameters a little bit. What harm can it possibly do? And that temptation is very strong. I can appreciate that. But you know the saying, right? How does a person go bankrupt? Two ways: gradually, then suddenly. And that's the thing. You don't think that it matters. Oh, a little bit here and there, it doesn't matter. But eventually, it will all add up. And that's why virtually in all cultures around the world have the same saying, that have variants of the same saying, which is that wealth does not last 3 generations. And we are determined in Singapore not to let that happen to us, but to keep on building something better for our children. And the reserves rules ensures that we do that. I think if we start going on the premise that we use more today, what essentially will happen and what we are essentially saying is to our children and the next generation, you pay more taxes down the road. That's what it comes down to. But I don't think that would be the right thing to do at all.
Okay. Very good.
And
Please.
So Minister explained the macro picture. I'll give you the micro on this opportunity cost. If you think that consumers are not spending enough because they're being forced into savings, then Singapore, actually most people are banked. We should see a rise on their credit card debt because they want to consume more today, but we don't see that. So it's not, I think the premise may be incorrect that there's this opportunity cost and consumers are being forced and that's why they're spending less. I don't think there's evidence at the micro level to that.
Yeah,
Although Singaporeans are quite prudent, you know. So
no, but then you were saying
they want to spend more, but they also feel the need to be careful.
But we shouldn't. Being prudent and disciplined is a virtue, and long may that continue.
It is.
I just want to add that had the previous generation or all these years, we did not think that way. And then when the pandemic hit, we might not have, we might not have enough. We think that, oh, maybe we'll just spend a bit more here and there. It doesn't matter here and there. So we might not have enough reserve to get us through.
Absolutely.
And that's what happened to a lot of countries.
Absolutely. So I think we should be appreciative of how our forefathers approached the reserves. They did not think along the lines of, let's just optimize our consumption, so to speak, and spend as much as we can. They left behind the reserves. If they had spent more, if we had 20% less NIRC today because our forefathers spent more, GST would have to go up another 2 percentage points to 11%. That's why if we were to do that, take the same approach today, our children will end up paying more taxes. Not to mention that that's on the tax, that's on in terms of the income that we get from the reserves. But there's also the fact that we can use the reserves as a rainy day fund in times of crisis. So to the point of whether or not there's a need for flexibility on the NIRC, the point that Vikram you asked just now, the answer is we already can use the reserves. If there is a crisis, if there is an emergency, then we will go through the process, the due process, we seek the President's approval, and we can use more than a 10 or 20% increase in the NIRC. We can dip into the reserves where necessary and where the circumstances require us to do so. So there is no need for these, flexibilities in the NIRC, which I fear. You have flexibility. Tomorrow you say 60%. Are you sure we will bring it back to 50%, or the 60% will go on to 70 and 80%?
Okay. So there's also an opportunity cost to spending the reserves.
Of course.
Okay.
Today is $20 billion, if I'm not mistaken. NIRC that contributes to the operations of the government. 20 billion is the biggest component of across all different tax revenues.
Yeah, it's the single largest revenue.
So if we were to use 100% of whatever we build and not put it in the reserves, in no time at all, this will fade. Your GST will go up, your income tax will go up. All the different things we're talking about today, we will be more like a OECD country probably,
and
with high taxation rates.
And if there's a crisis that hit us, we will not have we will not have much to fall back on.
Okay, we have time for just one more question, and that is the carbon tax. I think climate activists have welcomed the increase in the carbon tax that you have proposed in the budget. But is there a concern that companies may relocate operations, or some operations, to avoid this? Should we just accept that as collateral damage, or is there something that we can do to prevent it?
In the near term, that concern is real, which is why, because in the near term, if you look around the region, not many countries have a carbon tax to begin with. And so the risk of carbon leakage can happen, which is why we will have to put in place, as I had announced in the budget, a transition framework and allow for some allowances in the near term.
Exemptions, you mean?
That's right.
Yeah.
But in fact, all the companies that we have spoken to understand the importance of decarbonizing, moving to net zero. So in fact, all of them already apply a shadow carbon price or internal carbon price for their own projects. And they also have plans to get to net zero by 2050 or thereabouts. So I think the direction is aligned, and the near term, we can deal with the impact on the near term. But beyond that, I think the direction is aligned, and we should be able to move forward on the carbon tax without too much of an impact on our overall competitiveness. In fact, it will be the other way, that in the sense that I think moving early offers us the first mover advantage to seize the many opportunities that are out there with regard to the new green economy.
Sumit, you had some thoughts on the carbon tax you were talking about earlier. Would you like to share them?
Yes, I think this is a great move. Singapore took leadership in showing that they're going to raise the carbon tax on the corporations. But I have an addition to that we can take leadership on, which is, look, having carbon tax on the corporation is one thing, but the ultimate users or creators of carbon are the individuals. Consumers create carbon because of their food habits, because of their utilities, and because of the transportation. Now imagine if we could create a scorecard, a carbon scorecard for individuals. Now we can know who should be given a rebate, carbon rebate. they could go in and get an income tax rebate through the government, say, oh, your carbon footprint is low because you don't eat meat that is high in carbon, like beef is 20 times higher than, say, fish or even lentils. Now, those people are cross-subsidizing somehow the people who are eating very high carbon. So they could be given the second thing could happen, that they could actually get some kind of a green financing. Banks could say, oh, you actually have a low carbon score. So we can actually give you some cheaper credit on your mortgages or your credit cards. I could even think about, why should we have a carbon tax for consumers as opposed to corporations, maybe even corporations in addition, is because when the tax is salient to the consumer, they pay more attention to it and they respond to it better. When it's not salient, when it's at the corporation, they don't think about it. And one more thing I would think is that with the carbon tax on the consumer, there are peer effects. The peers, people talk about it. Oh, my carbon footprint is X, yours is Y, so let me try to bring it down to your level. So I think that gamification will also help all of us try to bring down our carbon footprint. So I think my view is that Singapore could be the leader in showing the world, just like creating a FICO score or any other score, we are going to create a individual level carbon score and let the world adopt it.
You make everybody vegetarian or fish eaters.
No, I'm just saying there should be no cross-subsidization.
Well, I mean, Professor Sumit has a good idea. It's something we continue to study and see how we can really bring it down to the individual consumption level. And in some ways, we are doing it in certain aspects. If you think about what you've just proposed, a fee-based system,
Yes.
carrots and sticks.
Yes.
Fees and rebates. We do that for electric cars, electric vehicles.
Exactly.
Incentives, if you go for cleaner, and then there's a stick if you choose the dirtier. So you could think about extending something similar in other areas. But I think the other aspect of this, besides a carbon tax, besides having incentives, is standards. And in some ways, whether it's for transport or for appliances, we will have to think harder about regulatory standards and phasing out things that are dirty, phasing out things that are inefficient. So that simplifies the choices too. You don't even get to choose, right?
Yes.
So eventually we will phase out internal combustion engine vehicles, and you can apply that for inefficient home appliances, energy inefficient home appliances. We'll just phase out. And I think with a combination of these different tools, taxes, incentives, and standards, we can achieve our net zero ambitions.
A bit like plastic bags.
Ah, yes.
Where NTUC led.
5 cents a bit.
Are you going to charge more for plastic bags? Is NTUC going to charge for plastic bags?
We were the leaders
You were the leaders.
to experiment in 5 cents. So
5 cents.
some people like it. Some people like it for the sustainable point of view, sustainability point of view. Some people don't quite like it because now you're going
I'd better buy some reusable bags.
I have a thought on that.
Okay.
Actually, I'm thinking a lot about sometimes pricing mechanisms work, but other times we could actually think of what cigarette companies have done and have some very bad pictures on their labels.
Not cigarette companies, governments.
So imagine that you have these plastic bags and they have pictures of whales dying.
Oh my God.
That
Okay.
will discourage people to carry.
Okay, final question, absolutely the last. It's a big picture question. Finance Minister, what kind of economy and society would you like to see in 10 years' time?
On the economic front, I would say we hope for a stronger, more resilient and greener economy, where Singapore will always be that special node in the global network, with the best teams assembled here, doing cutting-edge, exciting work and creating value for ourselves and for the world. And on the societal front, we want to be fairer, more equal, and more inclusive as a society, where everyone will be able to achieve their full potential, everyone will be able to give of their best, but with the assurance that they will not be left to fend for themselves when times are bad, and we will always be there for them, having their backs and moving forward together as one people.
Very good. On that very positive note, I'm afraid I have to bring this discussion to a close. Thank you, Finance Minister, and thank you, fellow panelists, for a stimulating discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.